A for the day for Charlotte. All right, let's go back to, no, it doesn't like me. Let's go back to, all right. So the thing to, again, the thing to notice here is that the DAS curve is upward sloping because of this positive coefficient. The DAD curve is downward sloping because of this negative coefficient. The things that are in the square brackets are things that shift the DAS curve or the DAD curve in whatever configuration you're looking at. Okay, so keep that in mind, because at some point we're going to be doing problems, and I'm going to say, suppose X changes, you need to figure out which curve to shift. All right, now, here's a question I bet you haven't thought about, but maybe you'll prove me wrong. What is dynamic about the DAD-DAS model? Why do we call it dynamic? It's not just because it's cool, though Rob was definitely thinking that. Those of you in, oh, go ahead.
Well, static models show like, they show X change in Y, whereas dynamic model shows more than one change in different variables.
Okay, and who's talking? I cannot see you.
Sabiel.
Oh, you made it. Awesome.
Oh, yeah.
Awesome. Oh, there you are. You're the almost invisible guy. No, that's Matthew. Sorry.
Oh.
Matthew is backlit so badly. There you are. With your awesome background. Okay, cool. Adam. What does Adam Thompson want? Oh my gosh, these ruggers, they're so needy.
I think he wants a green card.
Oh, well, yeah, there's that. Okay. So those of you in Econ 461, have you learned the difference between dynamic and static simulations yet? Jess is just really wants to answer this question, I know. Jess, have you learned the difference between dynamic and static simulations?
We learned the dynamic models.
Okay, so how does it work?
Well,
what makes it dynamic?
Because it's hard.
No. Good answer. Anybody? I mean, it's just, it's related.
It's taking into account the previous, so the expectations pi e over here, is taking into account like the previous time period. So that's part of what makes it dynamic.
So you're talking about our model, not simulations.
Well, yeah.
Okay, correct. The short way to think about this, oh, that's interesting. I don't know where that line came from.
You can annotate other people's. Hi.
Oh, look at that. So the short answer is it takes several periods to reach the final equilibrium point. The models that we've looked at so far have pretty much been one period models, right? There's a shock and it takes a period and you're back to equilibrium, okay? These models are more realistic. They take many, well, at least multiple periods to return to equilibrium, okay? Just as an example, oh, that was not good. Let me see if I can get that back. Okay, I did. As an example, you know, think about unemployment. We think of unemployment as a disequilibrium situation in the labor market. And we know that unemployment lasts for a while, which means it takes multiple periods for the labor market to get back into equilibrium. Similarly, with a longish recession, it takes multiple periods for the product market to get back into equilibrium. Okay, so what we're suggesting with the DAD-DAS model is that this is the norm rather than the exception. Okay, it takes multiple periods to get back to equilibrium. Now, in this particular model, we're going to differentiate between short-run equilibrium, which occurs at the end of every period, where DAS equals DAD, and long-run equilibrium, where GDP finally returns to potential. Okay? So that's what we're going to demonstrate here. All right. Let's see. Can I do this? Yeah. Okay. All right. So we're going to start with a simple demand shock story. Okay. If you want to follow in the book, I don't mean literally this moment. This is a simpler version of the story spelled out in figure 15-8. Okay. So there's a positive demand shock. Okay. Maybe it's an increase in export demand. The DAD curve shifts out, which means we are moving along the DAS curve. Let's think back about what the DAS curve looks like. It's right here in the graph. Remember, this came from what we call the modern expectations augmented Phillips curve. What it means is that there's a Phillips curve part that we modified using Okun's law so that we're looking at Q minus QP instead of unemployment minus the natural rate of unemployment. So there's a Phillips curve part which measures tightness or weakness in labor markets or product markets. There's the inflationary expectations part of the story. And there's the supply shock part of the story. That's V sub T. Okay. Now, if you think back to the DAD curve up here, okay, what's happening with a demand shock is the epsilon term is changing. Okay, so before the shock, supply and demand shock terms have a value of 0. And now with the shock, epsilon increases to a positive number, shifting up the DAD curve. All right. Now, inflationary expectations haven't changed. There is no supply shock. So what's happening in this equation when DAD increases?
Current GDP.
Right. Q sub T, the current level of GDP, is going to increase. And when that does, inflation rises too. Okay. So when there is a positive output gap, QT rises, that's going to result in GDP rising because of the Phillips curve relationship. Does everybody see that? Anybody have questions? Dang, you're not confused yet? We can see what's going on here in figure 1. Okay. We have our DAD curve, we have our DAS curve. we're in equilibrium at Q0, which initially is equal to Q sub P. And then there's this increase in aggregate demand caused by the demand shock. We're moving up the DAS curve. The demand shock raises GDP, and because of the Phillips curve, inflation rises from Q0 to Q1. We started at point A, which was a short-run equilibrium and a long-run equilibrium, and we end the period at point B, which is a short-run equilibrium, but not a long-run equilibrium. Okay, this is the end of period 1. Anybody have questions?
A quick question.
Thank you.
You said that that was the short run equilibrium, but not the long run equilibrium.
Yes.
In the long run, is it going to shift back to A?
In the long run, GDP will be equal to potential. So sort of yes, A would work. Other questions? What are you drinking there, Jack?
A beer.
That's what I thought. That's the spirit. It's 5 o'clock somewhere, right? Like Australia?
5 o'clock in Britain.
Mhm.
About midnight in Australia.
All right. Period 2. What happens in period 2? Well, let's think about it, okay? At the beginning of period 2, people realize that inflation is higher than it was initially. So inflation has increased. When people realize that, they raise their inflationary expectations. And when they raise their inflationary expectations, what happens to the DAS curve? Jess? Jess?
Say Jess.
Yes, I said Jess.
Yes.
So the question is, if inflationary expectations go up, what happens to the DAS curve? Do you want a hint?
Goes up.
It's in the square brackets. So yes, the DAS curve shifts up. Okay. Because it's shifting up, the inflation rate rises again. Okay. Now, let's go back to this graph. What you're going to see is this DAS curve is going to be moving in this direction. It's going to be moving up the DAS curve. Okay. Sorry, I misspoke. It's going to be moving up the DAD curve, right? So let's go back and think about the DAD curve. This is the one that's more complicated. These are the initial equations. We have our initial aggregate demand equation. According to this, if there is no demand shock, what would cause GDP to diverge from its potential?
I don't think there was a vision. Because Steph didn't have a vision for that.
Aspen, how about you? What would cause GDP, according to this equation, to diverge from potential? This is 0.
If like the rate changed,
What rate?
the RT.
If the real interest rate moved away from the natural interest rate,
Right.
right? So if RT rises, it's going to be greater than rho, and that's going to cause GDP to fall below potential, right? An increase in interest rates is going to lower GDP below potential, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what would cause R to rise? Well, from the Fisher equation, we can see that R is the nominal interest rate minus inflationary expectations. Okay. And the nominal interest rate comes from the monetary policy rule here. Okay, so it's fair to say that the main action, the main
So if inflation fell or if interest rates rose, then it would increase?
Yes, okay. So the main action as we move along the DAD curve is the Fed executing its monetary policy rule. Okay, so keep that in mind. So let's look at this again. Okay, this I stole from last week. So what we have here is what's in the curly brackets, which is the red indicator here. That's the monetary policy rule. Okay. Then what we have in the rainbow colored line here is the Fisher equation. Remember, this is I minus inflationary expectations. Okay. And I minus inflationary expectations is the real interest rate, which we then subtract rho from. That's the yellow line, the big fat yellow line, which shows us once again, and this Aspen should be thinking about this, alpha times R minus rho, right? So it all starts with the Fed here. All right. So there's a couple ways to tell the story. I'm going to tell it the simplest way possible right now. Let's focus on the output gap. Remember, the increase in aggregate demand caused GDP to rise above potential. The Fed sees that positive output gap, and what do they do according to the monetary policy rule? Ankitha?
Could you repeat that?
Yes. GDP rises above potential in period one due to the demand shock. The Fed sees that Q is greater than QP, and according to the monetary rule, what do they do to interest rates?
Increase?
They increase interest rates. Okay, they increase nominal rates, and then that trickles into real rates. And suddenly, we have this divergence here. R is greater than rho. Okay, higher interest rates then slow the economy down, and GDP falls. Okay, does everybody follow that? That's complicated, but that's the main thing that's happening when we move up the DAD curve, when we move along it. Okay, so just to summarize, at the beginning of period 2, QT is greater than QP. The monetary policy rule says raise interest rates to lower GDP. This causes a movement up the AD curve, and we end up at the end of the period at point C on the following graph, right there. So DAD curve, the DAD curve shifted initially, and in the second period, because of people's rising inflationary expectations, the DAS curve shifted back. And so we went from A to B to C. C is another short run equilibrium.
sitting over there. You don't, that low is vendor provided. So, okay, there's no core, all right.
Anybody have questions about that?
So what do you do?
Could you go back to the previous slide, please, just to show the step-by-step?
You know,
Thank you.
little reports, the way Richard Anderson does, or the way they do under PMCS, where you can get dashboards.
Sierra's got it.
So realistically, why would the Fed want to slow the growth of GDP? Is it just that they would want to encourage saving and that we wouldn't be able to sustain that level of growth?
It's because they know that we can't sustain that level of growth, and we know
Okay.
that that's going to be inflationary.
Got it. That makes sense.
And again, remember, this doesn't really require a meeting of the Federal Open Market Committee. They've already given instructions to the New York Fed. And so when the New York Fed observes this is going on, they can almost immediately start to raise interest rates. Other questions? Rachel, does that make sense to you? Darn.
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. Jess? You're good? Good. All right. End of period 2. Now, beginning of period 3. Let's go back to our graph. What do we discover at the beginning of period 3? What do people discover at point C?
Inflation is still rising.
They discover that inflation is higher than they expected it was, because they were still thinking about pi sub 1, and now they discover we're at pi sub 2. So they increase their inflationary expectations again. And when they do, what happens to the DAS curve? Here's the hint. Rob, what do you think?
It's gonna shift right.
It's going to shift up.
Or up, yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Once again, rising inflationary expectations shift the DAS curve, causing inflation to rise. And we can see that on the graph right here. Okay, the same action is going on as we move along the DAD curve. GDP is still above potential, so the Fed is still going to increase interest rates, and that's going to slow the economy down further. And we're going to end up at the end of the day, pun intended, at point D right here.
Is the shift between C and D smaller than the shift between B and C?
Yes, it is. What does that mean? Anybody know?
Is the expectations just smaller than it was from B to C then? Or?
Yeah, what it means is they didn't underestimate as much the second time as they did the first time. So they're catching up with their expectations. So at the beginning of the next period, what do people discover? Lillian?
That inflation is still higher.
Yes, they do. And so how do they respond to that?
Their inflationary expectations are increased.
That's correct. And when they do that, what happens to the DAS curve?
Correct. It'll shift up again.
Yes, it will. Okay, everybody see that?
Is it just gonna keep on shifting upward until DAS meets DAD at QP?
Darn you.
Sorry.
You're supposed to be confused. My next question was going to be, what happens? When does this end? So what's the answer? Each additional shift is smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually we get to here. Okay, let me just jump ahead. We get to here at DAS star. Okay. And that's where everything stops. GDP is back to potential. And so the Fed doesn't have to raise interest rates anymore. Okay. And so that point that I forgot to label E is a short run equilibrium, but it's also a long run equilibrium. And that's where it stands. That's where we stay.
So, Dr. Greenlaw, is only one shift in DAD?
Correct. Let me say it differently. DAD, there's one demand shock, and then everything else is a response to that. Everything else is endogenous in the story.
Right, so that was the initial shock that caused all of this.
Correct.
Okay.
It was the shock which caused a series of reactions.
Does the shock go away eventually?
Not in the way I've told the story. We'll get to that in a minute. Does anybody else have questions about this version of the story? Really? Good. Wow, I'm disappointed. I was really hoping to confuse you. Maybe just that that Australian dude with the muscles. I think he's confused. I don't mean you, Harry. I mean the guy behind you.
No, I knew you didn't mean me.
All right. Anybody have questions? What's the marginal cost of a question during the final compared to today? I would think it's higher on the final because there's more pressure, you know, so you're better off asking your questions today. All right. Okay, so the story that Mankiw tells is different and a bit more complicated, okay? So we will tell the rest of his story. His story says, what if the demand shock is not permanent, but lasts a discrete number of periods? I think he said 4 or 5. Okay. So what would be different if, say, at point D, the demand shock went away?
DAD would shift back to its original position.
Correct. DAD would shift back to its original position. And when it did, where would we be?
Under potential?
We would be right here. Can you see the cursor? Right here? Okay. So we would be under potential. Okay, now the problem is people would still be expecting inflation to be where it was at point D, which is pi 3. So what would happen to DAD initially? Do you understand my question?
Well, if people are still expecting inflation to be higher, would the DAS curve still shift back, even though,
Would shift up at least one more time.
which would lower the Q even further, like
Yes, it
move
would.
up the DAD curve?
Yes. Eventually, what's going to happen is people are going to realize that inflation isn't as high as they thought it was. And at that point, the DAS curve will start to shift in the correct direction, down and to the right. The Fed will be lowering interest rates to stimulate aggregate demand and to increase GDP back up to potential. It may well take a number of rounds. It may even take more rounds to get down than it did to get up, because we've got people's expectations going in the wrong direction at first. But eventually DAS would shift back to point A where we started, and everything would be done at that point. Any questions about that?
And this is if the positive shock goes away, right?
Correct.
Okay.
If the shock is permanent, then we're going to have permanently higher inflation, which kind of makes sense.
If the
If
shock
the
is
shock is only temporary, inflation shoots up and then it comes back down again. Sorry. Go ahead, Sid.
if the demand shock is permanent, wouldn't producers see that there's an increase in demand in the long run and increase the potential in the economy?
How do we increase potential in this model?
I don't know.
Anybody?
Decreasing interest rates?
Let's go back to the equations. Let's see. What determines QP? This is a very subtle question. So it's not obvious. You shouldn't necessarily know this. It is exogenous. It is not determined within the context of the model. So to answer your question, Sid, that is assuming the problem away. Okay, so maybe that means the model is imperfect. How does potential output increase? And what can firms do that, to help that?
It increases through investment, right?
Business investment, yeah, would increase the capital stock. What else is needed? Think steady state.
Would be
Do machines run themselves?
No.
That unemployment thing.
We would need more employment as well, right? So we can change QP, but in the context of this model, it is exogenous. So that can't be the answer to a problem like wouldn't firms respond? Yes, they would, but this model doesn't incorporate that. That is exactly the kind of question that I like to throw on the final exam, where I kind of expand the model, but I can't do that now because Sid already asked. Darn. Okay, other questions? I find myself thinking of that Ferris Bueller movie when the professor goes, anyone? Anyone? All right, that's all I want to do today. On Wednesday, we will do a demand shock. Okay, so what I would do is study your notes, maybe go over the book, figure out what you don't understand, and then we will continue on Wednesday.
Did you mean a supply shock?
Supply shock, yes, thank you. I guess I have to take you out of the doghouse now. Yeah, we'll do a supply shock on Wednesday. All right. Anybody have questions? All right, well, I'll see you Wednesday then.
You too. Have a good one.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.